Hey everyone, welcome to Talks at Google. I'm Matt Bonjovi, and I'm delighted to be welcoming as our guest for today, Dr. Karen Bakker. Dr. Bakker is the Martina S. Horner Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and she's a professor at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Her research focuses on the implications of digital innovation for environmental governance and sustainability. Some of her work looks at how the tools of the digital age might be mobilized to address the most pressing environmental problems facing the world today. Dr. Bakker is the author of more than 100 academic publications and 7 books, including her most recent work, The Sounds of Life: How Digital Technology is Bringing Us Closer to the Worlds of Animals and Plants. Today, we'll be talking through some of the ideas Karen presents in her book about digital technology, its roles and limitations in natural research, and what the future of human-animal interactions might look like. Now, throughout our discussion, you might have some great questions that you'd like answered. If you do, please go ahead and add them to the chat on the right. We will have time shortly for Dr. Bakker to answer some of these, so be sure to get your questions in early. But first, Karen, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Your book covers a range of research that has been conducted within the realm of bioacoustics and ecoacoustics. And one particular story you have is about a researcher who has a focus on turtles. To start us off, can you tell us a bit about this project?
Absolutely. So one of the chapters in the book does focus on turtles. They're a marvelous example of the power of digital bioacoustics. And it's like a scientific sleuth mystery story, which takes place in the Amazon. A researcher named Dr. Camilla Ferrara, who at the time was getting her PhD and now works with a conservation organization in Brazil, approached her PhD supervisor with, let's say, a controversial hypothesis she wanted to investigate. And that was the hypothesis that turtles make noise. A specific species, Podocnemus expansa, which is this amazing, very large Amazonian freshwater turtle that you might have seen photos of. They have this amazing ability to gather across hundreds or thousands of miles from all over the Amazonian basin. They come together in large numbers on these beaches where they haul out and they create their nests. So Camilla's hypothesis was that the turtles could coordinate their behavior through acoustic communication. Now, the response she got was skeptical, to put it mildly. Her doctoral thesis advisor told her, "You'll never get your PhD. Turtles don't make noise. We know that." Well, she persisted, in part because there was another wonderful researcher named Jacqueline Giles in Australia who had just published some fascinating work showing that a species of freshwater turtle there actually made an astounding variety of sounds. And Camilla reasoned, why shouldn't, the Amazonian cousins do the same thing? To make a long story short, after several years of painstaking research in some of the remotest reaches of the Amazon, Ferrara proved that this particular species of turtle makes a lot of noise, but very faint, not really at a very high volume, and with very long turn-taking intervals. The turn-taking interval between humans is quite short, as it is with birds, actually. Turtles are very patient conversationalists. They might wait a minute or two before responding. She spent hours just waiting for turtles to make noise, which she eventually recorded and determined not only are they making hundreds of different sounds, but even more astounding, baby turtles of this species make noise in their eggs before they hatch. They're coordinating the moment of their birth with a specific acoustic signal. And not only that, the mother turtles are waiting in the water, calling to their babies, and then guiding them to safety in the forest away from predators. And this has been determined using biologgers and drones. So this was the first documented evidence of parental care in chelonians, and it's work like that is subverting a lot of what we had assumed about acoustic communication across the tree of life. Humans tend to believe that what we cannot observe does not exist. There has been, until recently, not a lot of effort put into listening to the sounds made by other species, much of which occur either above our hearing range or below our hearing range. But now that we have essentially these digital hearing aids that we can operate at a local, a regional, even a continent-wide scale, we're learning some pretty astounding things about the ubiquity of acoustic communication across the tree of life. And that's really what the book, The Sounds of Life, is about.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned there that Ferrara's PhD advisor basically kind of laughed in her face at this suggestion of that turtles were using this acoustic communication. Why was there that certainty? Is that's just because, as you mentioned, like people hadn't really considered this prospect, or like where did that certainty come from?
Yeah, so there's a long history in Western science of privileging sight over hearing.
Yeah.
That in some ways dates back to the scientific revolution, when the telescope and the microscope were foundational inventions, combined with the advent, of course, of the printing press and the rise of text-based communication, in which sort of literacy replaces orality. Long ago, our ancestors had much more oral cultures and cultivated the art of listening and the art of memory that fell by the wayside, essentially with all these innovations in the Industrial Revolution. And it also was very difficult technically to record the sounds of other species because, as I mentioned, they were either very faint and intermittent, or they were beyond our hearing range. So it's just a marvelous time in sonics. I call sonics the new optics. I believe it's as profound a revolution as the telescope or the microscope. What is particularly exciting about the past decade is, Moore's law applies to these devices as to many other things. And so we've had a rapid reduction in cost and an increase in portability. And the extension, if you like, of the ability to use these listening devices to many more scientists and even amateurs is what's now accelerating exponentially this discovery process. It's like a little Cambrian explosion of discovery
Yeah.
of acoustic communication and lots of other species.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll want to come back to that point about kind of the democratization of the technology in a bit. But one of the takeaways that I had from the story about the turtles and thinking through our approach to what we think might be happening in the world is that we don't yet really have a deep understanding of large parts of the natural world. And I think one result of this lack of understanding is that we don't necessarily have a full picture of the impact that we as humans are having on the natural environment. Uh, can you tell us a bit about the work that you've seen specifically on the topic of like noise pollution and its impact on some of the different species and their approaches to communication?
Yeah, right. It's a really important point. So on the one hand, you have this explosion in scientific research on acoustic communication in all sorts of species, from charismatic megafauna like whales and elephants to honeybees, bats,
Right.
coral. I hope we get to talk about coral. Um,
Yeah.
and on the other hand, you have a really alarming research agenda that is documenting the effects of noise pollution on a broad range of species. So we know that noise pollution is bad for humans. If you're exposed to noise, even the ambient levels of noise in most big cities today, it'll increase, cardiovascular risk, stress and heart attack, cognitive impairment. So high levels of ambient noise are associated with increased risk of dementia. Or developmental delays. So we know noise is bad for us, but it turns out it's even worse for many other species that are exquisitely sensitive to sound in ways we had not previously realized. And so there's many examples, plants and animals, I should add. Just one very brief example. It turns out that the embryos of fish eggs are highly sensitive to motorboat noise. There was a headline in the science recently, motorboat noise is scrambling the eggs of baby fish,
Right.
which is more or less accurate. We had no idea until recently that the sound we were making was increasing stress, increasing risks to reproduction, to finding prey, to lots of species. But it turns out that sound can actually kill them. Loud seismic air guns, for example, can kill zooplankton up to a kilometer away from the blast site. It's like a sonic scythe just cutting through the water and killing, what is essentially the basis of the marine food chain. So noise pollution is sort of one of the great unrecognized human and environmental health threats of our time. And that's also something I go into in the book.
Yeah. And how kind of ubiquitous is this issue? I mean, is this like how noisy are our oceans?
Yeah, the oceans in particular, where many creatures see the world through sound because sound travels better through water, then if you've ever been swimming and gone down any depth, you'll immediately recognize what I mean about being able to hear things much further away than you can see them, right? So in a marine and aquatic environments, essentially the industrialization of the world's oceans with the rapid increase in mechanized motors and shipping,
Right.
and the globalization of trade, combined with the relatively recent acceleration of marine resource exploration, oil and gas, deep sea mining, has created an exponential increase in most of the world's oceans in the past 20 years. And so the effects are pretty widespread. I'll just give one example of a very cool study
Yeah.
that came out about a year ago. Researchers in Barcelona had been doing work examining the effects of noise pollution on cephalopods. So, the experimental protocol is you have an aquarium, like a tank. You can put the creature inside it. You expose the creature to loud levels of noise, analogous to, a seismic air gun or a very loud motor from a container ship. And then you look at the results, and we know it's very damaging to cephalopods, and we suspect it's very damaging to whales. It may, sonar, lots of other things may be affecting these creatures. But then the researchers used their same experimental protocol on a plant.
Right.
This plant is called Posidonia oceanica. It's Mediterranean seagrass. Seagrass is, of course, like the savanna or like the boreal or the tropical forest. It's a very important part of our sort of global biodiversity framework. Seagrass is home to a lot of marine biodiversity, and it's been disappearing at a very rapid rate. Also of concern because it's a big carbon sink. So scientists thought, it's chemical pollution, it's boats dragging their anchors. They weren't quite sure. But it turns out that when seagrass is exposed to loud noise, organelles in the seagrass are damaged. Those organelles help the seagrass orient to gravity. But even more worrisome, the mycorrhiza that are on these plants, that just like trees, they help the plants absorb nutrients. The mycorrhiza, the fungal networks, were also damaged. So to give a simple analogy, it's as if you were exposed to a loud noise, all of a sudden you went deaf, but your stomach burst open and you couldn't eat any food. And also you couldn't orient yourself to gravity, so you couldn't even walk. That is the effect of loud noise on these plants. And some of these plants, by the way, are probably the oldest living organisms on Earth. They're clonal, and some of the organisms in the Mediterranean have been dated to between 100 and 200,000 years old. So they're in other ways pretty robust.
Yeah.
So these are examples of how worrisome noise pollution can be on a global scale.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of sticking with that point about the plants, you mentioned that we can kind of look and see physically what's happening to the plants under these conditions of noise pollution, but we can't necessarily see all of the things that we can see in an animal, where you can kind of see that it's potentially in distress or it's potentially
Yeah, I mean, in the case of animals, for example, you can measure stress hormones. So they
Right.
literally, you can get a research job following whales around the Gulf of Maine, scooping up their poop and measuring their stress hormones. Okay,
Right.
that's the research showed that after 9/11, when global shipping stopped,
Right.
stress in the whales reduced dramatically because they were measuring stress levels before and after, but I should say before the event and then during the kind of, the great quiet period. And COVID, because shipping slowed down, provided another moment when these results could be retested, and they're very robust. So lots of ways to do this in animals. In plants, you put them under the microscope, and you can see the organelles that are essentially blasted open.
Right.
They're called amyloplasts. I won't go into the detail, but essentially you can zero in on particular organelles that are very sensitive. A little bit similar to the way your ears would be damaged by a loud explosion. There's a specific sort of cascade that would occur. So the interesting thing is these experiments could have been done for decades, but we only recently started looking because in a way we had, preconceived notions about the ability of other species to hear or be attuned to sound. And now that the door is open, there's a ton of research that's being done. After the turtle research I told you, Camilla Ferrara, someone went out and recorded 50 different turtle species making noise. Lots of researchers are now looking at the way plants respond to acoustic communication. They're incredibly sensitive and nuanced listeners, better than we are at even distinguishing between different kinds of insect species simply through discerning different vibrational frequencies through acoustic communication. That's Heidi Appel's work at the University of Toledo. So fantastic. But we're only really at the beginning of this process. It's a little bit like Van Leeuwenhoek. He invents his microscope. He starts pointing it at the world. He points it at well water. He points it at breast milk. He sees all these microbes. But he had no idea it would eventually lead to the discovery of DNA. So we're kind of at that very early stage. We're just wandering around pointing our listening devices at all these species and not quite sure of what we're hearing or what we're going to find.
Yeah. And you mentioned that there's now this kind of ability of once people see what's been shown, then you can kind of go look what else is happening. Is the skepticism that Dr. Ferrara faced, is that continuing as well in kind of taking this and going to other areas?
I think the skepticism is largely abated. I mean, in the book, I cite the work of over 4,000 researchers. Bio and ecoacoustics used to be a fairly small, constrained discipline because the equipment you needed was pretty specialized and would fill an entire minivan. Now these devices are small, light, and portable and cheap. You can build one yourself for less than $100. You can put it in your back pocket as you do your research or go for a walk in the forest. And so there's all these great citizen science initiatives. I mean, the Norfolk Bat Survey basically lets people loan out these devices, go and record bat sounds, bring them back. There's a ton of interesting citizen science initiatives. All of this means there's a very large accumulated body of evidence about the fact that many species we once thought not to be vocally active are in fact vocally active. That's point one. There's a lot more sound out there than we were aware of. And point two is that those acoustic communication mechanisms, they contain more ecologically complex information than we previously realized. And that's where AI comes in, because we have these very large data sets, and then we can label data sets. I'm making it sound easier than it is, but you can
Just do that
actually
and you're good.
you can train AI your algorithm to recognize patterns in these data sets of non-human sounds. And by painstakingly doing field research and linking those sounds to non-human behaviors and testing those through playback experiments, you can begin to decode the meanings of the acoustic communication of other species. So that's how we know that elephants have a specific word for honeybee. They have a specific word for human. That's how we know that many species have individual names. We didn't know that 10 or 15 years ago.
Right. Yeah, and one of the species that you talk about in the book as being one where we didn't really appreciate the complexity of their communication is in whales. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of the complexity and almost the cultural uniqueness of some of the communications that whales have?
Yeah. So, I mean, if anyone on the Zoom has heard whale song, you'll be aware of humpback whales. Probably that's what a lot of people have heard. The discovery, quote unquote, the scientific observation of whale sounds sort of dates to the mid 20th century. I should add it was a rediscovery of something that indigenous whaling cultures had long known. So this rediscovery by Western science of whale song was very much focused on species like the humpback whale, which have these very complex vocal song registries that are fascinating because they are learned. So there's vocal learning. They're associated with different groups of whales. So there's a social, cultural aspect, and they can be transmitted between groups. So there's been documentation of whales sort of inventing a new song, singing it, and then passing it on to another group of whales. The transmission of acoustic information by whales across large distances in the ocean is now well established. Whales, for example, can dive down to what is called the SOFAR channel. It's a very particular, if you like, layer in the ocean that, because of specific temperature, salinity, and pressure conditions, acts like a long distance communication mechanism for acoustic information. The US Navy found out about this channel in the mid 20th century. And when they began listening in this channel, for enemy submarines and that sort of thing, they heard all these strange noises. They called them pesky biologicals. It turns out there were lots of different whales diving down. They had long ago perfected what humans had only discovered. So there is a mechanism whereby whales can communicate with one another across very long distances. A whale can be singing off the coast of Ireland and you can hear it in Bermuda. And so this is how this cultural transmission occurs. Now, what we don't yet know is whether whales have anything similar to what we believe defines human language and sets it apart in terms of, these combinatorial capacities, semantic syntax, etc. There are 2 research teams currently working on this. One is called Project SETI, the Cetacean Translation Initiative, which spun out of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. And the other is called Earth Species. Now, they're both looking at sperm whales. Sperm whales, unlike humpbacks, communicate in sort of it sounds like Morse code is the best way to describe it. Sounds like if you were near a sperm whale, which are some of the loudest animals on the planet, it would sound like it was knocking on the hull of your ship with a loud hammer. The sounds are so loud they could literally explode your eardrums if you were swimming near them, or worse. Yeah. So, but if we're going to find complex communication in whales, it's probably in something like sperm whales, and they're large-brained, very social, matrilineal, long-lived groups over time, which engage in vocal learning and pass these patterns down from one generation to the next. We have not yet cracked the code, but that's probably going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, which then raises the question of whether we could use AI, sort of digitally intermediated, soft robots, AI, to be speaking back to some of these creatures. And that is indeed already happening with other species like honeybees.
Right. And what does that look like? Like, what is happening? So you've trained some model that can then kind of find the patterns in what the bees are communicating?
Yeah. So to step back a moment, playback experiments have long existed in this field. So Lucy King in East Africa did some excellent work where she recorded the sounds of elephants exposed to different threats like honeybees, human hunters, and humans who were not hunters. The sounds are quite distinct. The elephant behaviors are quite different. Without recourse to AI, you can simply play those sounds back to elephants and see what they do. Similarly with mating calls, elephants, female elephants are only in estrus once every 4 years. Male elephants will come running from a very, very long way away when they hear that special call. You can do a playback experiment on these poor bull elephants to see if they respond to these sounds. They do. Right. So this is how, with playback experiments, Lucy King determined that elephants have a specific signal for honeybee, vocal signal, and for the threatening human hunter and the non-threatening human. So they're able to distinguish between different groups of humans. Now, what you can then do with AI is have much larger data sets. And this is being built by Joyce Poole and others. They're building an elephant ethogram, elephant dictionary, where you have large data sets of recordings of these different sound clips associated with specific behaviors. And through playback experiments, you can start really confirming whether or not your hypotheses about what these different signals mean are indeed correct. That's how we test for individual names. So if you isolate the snippet that you think is a dolphin's individual signature whistle, as they're called, it will peel off from the pod and come see you. Okay. Now, how could AI accelerate this? So AI doesn't really, AI essentially, of course, pattern recognition. You can feed it much larger data sets. And it can start discerning patterns that researchers hadn't realized were there. But without being linked to sort of behavioral analysis, it's sort of it's of limited utility. So typically what you get is researchers with knowledge of some species having already done experiments, just accelerating this research with AI. And that's how they've been able to do, for example, the work on bats. It's another chapter in the book, which shows that bats, which we long knew echolocated, also have these amazingly complex vocal communication regimes. We now know from with recording 15, 20 million vocalizations and often using biologgers to track the bats as they're making these different sounds. We now know some cool things about bats. They're a lot more like us than we realize. They hold grudges. They remember favors. They fight over food and resources. They socially distance and go quiet when ill. They trade food for sex. They engage in vocal learning. Adults, bats teach baby bats to speak much like you learned to speak. Your parents speak to you, you babble back. Eventually, you learn the right combination of sounds. So this could not have been done without AI, because a lot of that communication happens, first of all, but beyond our hearing range, and then much too fast for us to ever discern the patterns. So for these species that communicate beyond our hearing range, or incredibly fast, or maybe incredibly slow, like turtles, AI is very, very useful.
Right. That makes sense. And one of the things that you pointed to earlier about kind of the data that we have for a lot of these experiments is that some of the early data came from US military resources, especially some of like the ocean data. How does that source for the data kind of impact the research and what gets thought about?
I mean, it's complicated, of course, because environmental conservation has a long history of being associated with, militarization and security.
Right.
Uh, in the particular case of whales, the U.S. Navy kept that research secret a very long time, and some researchers who'd been exposed to it during World War II went off and did civilian research, notably at Woods Hole. But I would say it's first of all, it slowed down disseminating this information to the general public, and then of course there's always the worry about the potential misuse of these technologies, which of course can be used to listen and monitor, but also can be used to surveil and manipulate. There is the concern that you could use this kind of information in precision hunting or precision fishing. You could use it to domesticate species we had not previously been able to domesticate, or enhance the control of species we have domesticated. So these are very important concerns. There are not a ton of ethical guardrails in place. And so that's part of what the book tries to bring attention to say, look, this is happening. And it would be good for the conservation community to get out ahead of some of these nefarious uses.
Yeah. And do you think that there would need to be like a shift in approach to acquiring this data in order to make it potentially more aligned with different goals? Or do you think it's more just about having people in the room to set these
Mhm.
goals?
The whole question of the harvesting of environmental data is complicated. The next book I'm writing,
Yeah.
which will be out with MIT Press, is on digital Earth technologies, and there's often an assumption that we can harvest all of this data essentially without consent.
Right.
We certainly don't ask consent from the non-humans we're recording.
Yeah.
They're not legal persons. And another oversight is Indigenous data sovereignty. So Indigenous peoples being stewards to very large swathes of traditional territory on which there are higher levels of biodiversity. So often, and there's a growing movement around Indigenous data sovereignty, which asserts ownership of that data. And then certain protocols before the data could be shared or released. That is something that's happening within certain jurisdictions, in some South American countries, in Canada, but also at the United Nations. So I think getting a handle on data ownership, data privacy, and anticipating a future in which non-humans may have more legal rights than they have today is one part of it. And then I think another part of it needs to be certain protocols. For example, banning the use of these technologies in hunting or fishing, and incorporating that into regulatory frameworks. All of that needs to be stood up. Not yet happening, but I hope it will.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that also kind of points to this theme that emerges, which is that there are really important non-technical aspects to all of these things. There's the regulatory piece. There's kind of the strategic piece. How have you seen this thought process that I think exists a lot amongst kind of engineers and scientific people of really focusing in on the technology? How have you seen that impact the research that gets done and how it's thought about?
Mhm. I mean, this is an age-old human truth, right? We are fascinated by our ability to invent new tools, and then we're often terrified when we actually manage to invent them. That's not new. I think what is new in this case is it's these technologies that are emerging at a moment of great sensitivity to biodiversity loss. There is great hope that we could use these to conserve other species. For example, there's a ton of interesting work being done using this technology to automate listening for poachers. So you could hear motor noises or gunshots It's like some of the early work that was done actually was trying to train algorithms on elephant sounds and was also picking up gunshots that the researchers didn't know were in the recordings. So there's a ton we could do to automate poaching detection with appropriate guardrails, again, around the militarization of conservation. And so I understand the desire of engineers, scientists to forge ahead and invent these applications. There, Sheila Jasanoff at Harvard has a very pithy, lovely phrase to sum this up. There's the can-do mentality. Can we do this? But that we also need to have a should-do mentality. Should we do this? And that's where I think there's a little bit of a disconnect at the moment. There's a ton of enthusiasm and a lot of funding going into these tools, and yet the cumulative effect of releasing them into the wild may not actually lead to mitigating biodiversity loss in the way we hope. It may be that these should only be in the hands of a few organizations, that this should not be a widely available technology.
Yeah. And in thinking about those kind of trade-offs, is that something where you just need to have people who with really like on the ground experience who understand like the difficult nuances of these types of things, they're helping with the decision? Or how do you see that?
Yeah, well, let's take the case of national parks. They are, federated, they have associations,
Right.
nationally and globally. Lots of these technologies can help them monitor endangered species, protect against environmental crime and poaching. Those organizations are looking at these technologies and seeking to stand up sort of safety protocols for their use and collectively vetting which technologies are sort of approved. It's not quite FDA approval, but one can imagine a similar sort of oversight process that in this case is not officially government led, but it's led by conservationists. There's another approach that I think is part of a broader overhaul that's needed to environmental legislation. So the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, right? All of these date from the early 1970s in the US, as does most environmental legislation around the world, invented in a pre-digital era when the fax machine was the fastest thing we had to get, information from point A to point B, pretty much. So now, how do we reinvent environmental regulation and governance for the digital age to take into account some of these points? And that actually is the focus of my next book, because it's such a complicated topic, and that there's a kind of a global dimension to that, but then there are also local dimensions to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I imagine there's also this dimension of how technology companies and like organizations that have this kind of profit-focused agenda as opposed to like a research-focused agenda, I imagine that factors in as well.
I mean, it does, in the sense that the increasing proliferation of social impact companies that are using digital tech for environmental good is, on the one hand, positive, because for so long the mainstream tech sector ignored environmental issues. One could, however, be cynical and say that this is merely one more example of capitalism turning a threat into an opportunity, and sustainable development becomes a way to internalize externalities and profit from them. That's not a new insight. But I think what it does mean is that there's an important debate to be had about technology that merely monitors for the purpose of providing more information. For example, many large corporations run environmental monitoring and information systems. It would be really good for them to know more about the harm they could be doing to species, and acoustic indices are a great way to measure that. Versus what I think are more worrisome technologies that are attempting to use these innovations for interspecies communication, something I think we're not ready for, and for which we don't have an ethical protocol. I mean, first, do no harm. Doctors are trained before. If you can't be sure you're going to do harm, maybe better not to intervene. We don't really have the ethical frameworks in place. So if I were a VC investing in this space, I would be thinking quite carefully about that and thinking about things that could advance monitoring agenda within an existing regulatory framework and enhance accelerate environmental protection. It's more data rich, it's more real time, and I would probably hold off on this question of interspecies communication. It's just sort of the same way we adjudicate CRISPR. There are some use cases that are okay, and there are some use cases we've said off limits for now.
Yeah, definitely. I want to jump to a couple audience questions that we have. So Jamie asks, I'm very interested in the sounds made by plants. For example, I read The Hidden Lives of Trees that trees scream when cut down. Why do you think plants make different sounds?
So there are a wide number of studies that have now been released on plants making ultrasound above our hearing range. And the sounds they make are different depending on the state the plants are in. So one example is Yossi Yovel in Tel Aviv did a study of tomato and tobacco plants. The sounds they make when they are healthy, when they are dehydrated, or when they are injured are different. They're sufficiently distinct that you can train an AI algorithm. Yovel's team did this to listen, and simply by listening, they can tell you, yeah, the plant is healthy, the plant needs watering, the plant got injured. Right? So this is not the stuff of science fiction. The screaming part, I think, is a little bit of poetic license. Now, so the question is, why would plants emit these sounds? We're not sure how they do. The why, I can conjecture. This is conjecture. This is speculation. Plants emit sounds because other species like insects can hear those sounds, and there may be some evolutionary value to be built to convey ecological information about one's status. So this is analogous to biochemical signaling. We know trees send out biochemical signals when they're infected with something specific. You know, they have aphids or they have a pest. They send out a biochemical signal that attracts wasps. Wasps eat the bugs, right? Job done. So we don't quite know in plants why this signaling is happening. It may ward off insects who don't like the noise, who would otherwise be prone to attack these weak plants. We know that interspecies acoustic communication happens between predator and prey, for example, between bats and moths. Moths can jam bat sonar. So again, we're at the very beginning of this, but probably it has to do with predator-prey interactions. Conversely, the plants are also listening. Heidi Appel's work at the University of Toledo, fantastic research. She plays the sounds of insects to plants, very simple plants, model organisms in biology. The plants only release defensive chemicals when the recording is of an insect chewing on plant leaves. They don't respond to, classical music or heavy metal or whatever, forest noise. Moreover, the plants only release defensive chemicals when they hear a sound of their insect predator chewing on leaves of their plant species. Their sense of hearing is much, much more developed than our own. We think they do that with cilia. Inside your ears, what's enabling you to listen to me are little hairs that vibrate, particle motion. Plants have little hairs, trichomes, all over their leaves. Those are probably vibrating. Even simple organisms like coral larvae have cilia. So anything that has cilia can probably sense acoustic information, which is far more efficient ecologically. Biochemicals take a long time to produce and convey, and they're energetically expensive. Sound is much more efficient, especially to pick up if you're worried about a predator. So that's one of the reasons why it makes sense that plants would have evolved to sense information about insect predators from sound.
That makes sense. And I know this is kind of complete speculation, but has there been any early indication that there would maybe be a plant-to-plant signal to try and cause some?
Yeah, Monica Gadiano has done some really interesting work where she did companion planting of different species, and I can't remember the exact details of the experiments. I'm going to get it wrong, but there may indeed be. But I would say that's still a what-if question. Not enough research out there to give a definitive answer. Probably in 5 years we will have one.
That makes sense. Jumping to another audience question, SW asks, has there been any evidence of marine plants or animals showing adaptive structure or habit to this louder world? Perhaps preserved specimen structures versus modern around oral pressure sensitivity?
Yeah, great question. Birds. So there's been a lot of work on birds showing that the same species in an urban versus rural environment, the urban birds will have to sing louder, but also their song structure is less complex because it takes a lot more energy. It's like just being like you and I being in a loud bar.
Right.
We're
Yelling
not
at
having
each other.
we're just yelling at each other, and what we're saying usually becomes pretty simple.
Yeah.
But the cool thing is there was some research actually done in San Francisco in the Presidio during the pandemic. What happened when all of the noise from cars went away was the urban birds changed the way they sang. Rural birds, the control in Marin County, did not, but the urban birds of the same species start singing a little less loudly, but longer and more complex songs. That came back within weeks, months. So that one of the wonderful things about correcting noise pollution is, unlike chemical pollution, which can persist for, days, weeks, months, centuries, millennia, you can reduce noise pollution and the results are immediate and they're significant. So it's a really easy win in terms of conservation, also because any reduction in noise pollution also benefits us.
Yeah, that makes sense. And another audience question from Josh. Your research is beyond fascinating. Is there any correlation with your work that could rewrite our understanding definition of how we measure intelligence or self-awareness in other species?
Mm-hmm. So many, great question. Most of the contemporary researchers working on this issue avoid this question like the plague. It's very controversial. So they're really referring to, adaptations of information theory, Claude Shannon, information traveling between sender and receiver, who can distinguish signal from noise, and that results in sort of ecologically meaningful behavior, right? This is very codified language that avoids any mention of conflictual terms like language, like words, like intelligence, like self-awareness, like consciousness. Okay, just to set the record straight. So I will venture out on a limb and speculate, but most researchers would not. In fact, they would probably say it's irrelevant to us whether or not, our work advances those philosophical debates. We're just really interested in learning more about, these organisms sort of on their own terms. Nonetheless, I do think there are some very interesting connections to broader debates around sentience. The philosophers and the psychologists weigh in on this. Wittgenstein is famous for saying, if a lion could speak, we could not understand them. There's that famous paper by Nagel about what is it like to be a bat, and the assertion that we could never know what it is like to be a bat because their Umwelt, their lived experience of the world, is so different than ours, living in that bat body, speaking like a bat. Any listening we do to bat sound is just listening to a digital simulacra. It's slowed down. It's not actually like what the bat experiences. So what I think that debate misses is this new innovation of a digital intermediary. We might never be able to buzz like a honeybee or echolocate or vocalize like a bat, but our computers can, powered by AI. Right now, that AI is often sort of hard-coded with patterns. In the future, maybe there'll be more sort of advanced algorithms that are really in there learning like a baby bat would learn. There are some really interesting suggestions about using soft robots to be advancing this whole agenda and testing some of these ideas. But I would say it's complicated because it's there's a lot of scientific reluctance to do this work because of the new age fringe element to it. And so there's only a very few researchers that are brave enough to do the work or ask the questions. And I would direct the whoever asks that question to go and look at the research of people who are working in plant signaling and behavior, plant neurobiology. That's some really fascinating work. That's really challenging debates about what we think of as the continuum of sentience along the sort of spectrum of life and the maybe artificial divide between plants and animals on this question. That's one fascinating area of research. And then there is the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, which if you haven't read, you should. And again, makes reference not only to work in something like bioacoustics, but neuroscience. And so let me just say that that scientific debate is unfolding. There are not a lot of scientists brave enough to be sort of heterodox thinkers, but those are two great areas for you to go and learn more.
Yeah. And is this kind of one of those areas that you're mentioning where in thinking about what an AI intermediary between like a human and another species could be, this is one of those things where that lack of ethical framework then becomes quite concerning to the research that could potentially be conducted?
Indeed. And as I mentioned, so first of all, it's quite likely we wouldn't know what we were saying to other species, and there's the potential to be harmful. Um, and second, we haven't asked for consent. We simply don't know if these other species would want to speak to us, want to be recorded. Miriam Knornstild, who's a wonderful bat researcher in Germany, puts it very nicely, and I quote her in the book. She says, how sort of anthropocentric to assume that other species would want to speak to us. Maybe they don't. Maybe, and what's much more interesting for her, she says, is what are they saying to one another, and what are they saying to other species? It maybe we've evolved to a point where we're these distant cousins on the tree of life. We may never be able to have a meaningful conversation, and maybe we shouldn't try, but we can have a newfound appreciation for how rich their conversations are, and that's. So, moratorium on interspecies communication using AI, I would be in favor of that. I wouldn't win that argument. And there are these research teams who are forging ahead with it. So the best we can hope for is a lot more ethics review and some self-restraint on the part of venture capital, so all of this doesn't get too out of hand.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the themes that you had just mentioned before was that science, possibly because of kind of the new age influence of plants talking to plants, kind of had this very rigorous separation between the terminologies that get used for humans and those that get used for other species. In writing a book where you're kind of looking at lots of different research and putting that within like a narrative framework, how are you going about thinking about that balance and whether you would say that animals are having conversations or things like that?
I mean, the book is a work of popular science and science communication. And I think the way to handle that is, the book has several thousand references. It occupies an inordinately large number of pages. And so I think, first of all, robust research.
Yes.
And then I Monica Gagliano sums it up really nicely. She says, scientists shouldn't be afraid of asking what if questions. They could lead to a dead end. But in an era when you must have seen the recent Nature article about the sort of decline of disruptive science and the worries about that, we need to encourage a new generation of scientists to simply ask these what if questions. They may turn out to be wrong, but we're kind of, in many cases, sort of the paradigm's a bit exhausted in some of the research in biology and ecology. This sort of research takes it forward. And so in the book, what I've done is offer a synthesis of the new research, which would allow us to revisit some of these controversial questions, maybe redefine the concept of language in less anthropocentric terms. I don't answer those questions, but perhaps make space for researchers to start asking them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also one of the themes that you had that was quite interesting was that in this sort of approach to broadening horizons, there was some successful studies. I think it was specifically on like the bowhead whales, where there's this pairing of kind of indigenous people and their expertise and you were mentioning kind of their original discoveries that are then being rediscovered, and pairing that with technology. Can you speak a little bit about the success that approach has had?
Yeah, and I know we're nearly out of time. This is worth its own Google talk, and there's some great Indigenous scholars that I would really recommend people go read. Of course, Robin and Wall Kimmerer, John Burroughs, Dylan Robinson, who are all thinking about these issues. Very briefly, most of what I've talked about today has long been known by Indigenous communities. A sort of scientific amnesia combined with a culture of colonialism obscures that past. And so in the book, I interweave stories of deep listening with digital listening. As a non-Indigenous person, I don't want to sort of, there's a balance. You don't want to recolonize that information. But I think one important thing to take away in the first 2 chapters of the book explore in detail that when Indigenous knowledge holders collaborate with Western scientists, there is a place-based approach to generating this knowledge that has those ethical guardrails in place that we talked about, and that has a greater sense of stewardship and kinship that I think is desperately needed in a world where technology often disconnects us from nature. If digital tech reconnects us to nature, this place-based approach, rooted in Indigenous knowledge, I think offers a safer space, a more ethical place. And in the book, I put lots of further readings where people can go check out some of this amazing work being done by Indigenous communities that are really leaders in this field.
Yeah, definitely. And we have another audience question from Tom who asks, do you know anyone working on the relationship between massive tree planting projects and biodiversity?
Slightly tangential question. Yes, I mean, coming from British Columbia, where there's a lot of tree planting, there's a ton of work being done on this. I presume people have heard of the work of Suzanne Simard. I would definitely recommend you go check out her book, In Search of the Mother Tree, where she talks about the impacts of mass tree planting on biodiversity from the perspective of fungal networks. Fascinating researcher. Look at her TED Talk. That's a great place to start with that question.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we're just at time. Before people go, do you have any recommendations for how people can kind of get involved in some of this work and the things that we've been discussing today?
Yeah, a lot of the work, is open to citizen science, whether you're interested in birds, whether you're interested in whales, that you can do, crowdsourced data labeling. You can get some of these technologies yourself, go on sound walks. So I've put some links for getting involved at that link below, and really hope people get out and start listening.
Yeah, definitely. Karen, I want to thank you again for being here. It's been absolutely fantastic speaking with you and hearing all of the work that you've highlighted.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, Dr. Bakker's new book, The Sounds of Life, is available now wherever books are sold, including through your local and independent booksellers. It's a really fun and excellent read, so I recommend that people check it out. For everyone who joined us today, we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Take care.